They thought the cold would finish what their bullets started. Roman Falcone had spent 11 years teaching the city of Albany that his name was a thing to fear, a man of 37, with a tailored black coat, iron-gray eyes that never blinked first, and a jaw scarred by a knife that hadn't lived long enough to brag about it. He'd built an empire on docks and silence, on the unspoken rule that no one crossed a Falcone and walked away whole. But power makes men careless about the wrong faces, and the most dangerous face in his world had been smiling beside him for a decade. Now he sat strapped in a wheelchair he couldn't feel his legs beneath, dumped down a frozen ravine deep in the Adirondack wilderness, while the snow came down like the sky had finally decided to bury everything he'd done. No phone, no gun, no men, just the slow, patient cold pressing the warmth out of a body that had never once begged for mercy and now didn't know how. He'd given the order that killed his own brother on a lie, whispered by the very man who'd just left him here to die. And somewhere under all that ice, Roman Falcone made his peace with the dark, until the dark moved. Out of the swirling white stepped something enormous, black as a moonless night, broad as a barrel, with amber eyes that caught what little light remained and held it. A Neapolitan mastiff, scarred and silent. 150 pounds of forgotten war, that the world had thrown away the same way it had thrown away the man in the snow. It didn't bark. It didn't hesitate. It began to dig. And when it had pulled him half free of his frozen grave, it did the one thing no one in Roman's empire had ever done. It ran for help, vanishing into the storm toward a sagging cabin at the edge of the woods, where a 27-year-old widow named Mara Whitlock was counting the last of her money, and the days until the bank took the only thing she had left. She had buried a husband, swallowed a town's quiet contempt, and learned that kindness was a luxury people like her couldn't afford yet. When that great black dog dragged her out into the blizzard, she followed. She didn't know she was about to save the most ruthless man in the state, and he didn't know that the poorest woman in the valley was about to do what no army, no fortune, and no fear had ever managed to reach the frozen thing he kept where a heart should be. What that dog started in the snow that night would unravel a betrayal buried for years, and force a man who'd forgotten how to be human to learn it all over again from a widow and a stray. If a story about loyalty, second chances, and the unlikely souls who pull us back from the edge is the kind of thing that stays with you, do us a favor, tap that like button, share this with someone who needs a little hope tonight, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's go back to that ravine in the dark, where a dying man and a forgotten dog are about to change each other's lives forever. The scraping at the door rose through the storm like a sound that didn't belong to this night, and Mara Whitlock lifted her head from the stack of bills she'd counted over and over until she knew every red number by heart. Bear had never scratched at the door that way, not in that familiar manner of asking to come in from the cold, but with something frantic, urgent, almost desperate, his claws scraping again and again against the old wood while a low, heavy whine pushed out from a chest as solid as a stone wall. She opened the door, and a gust of snow struck her face with a sting as sharp as needles. The enormous black dog stood there covered in ice, his breath bursting into white clouds. Then he backed up 2 steps, turned his head toward the woods, gave one short bark, and looked at her with amber eyes as if he were trying to say something she had no choice but to understand. Mara hesitated, because outside it was 4 degrees below zero, and darkness swallowed everything more than 10 paces from the porch, because she was exhausted after a 12-hour shift, because reason told her to close the door, rely on her old landline only if an absolute emergency arose, and let the dog come inside to warm himself. Bear wouldn't come in. He barked again, turned toward the woods again, and there was something in the animal's stubborn certainty that made it impossible for her to turn away. So she snatched up her thickest coat, shoved her feet into boots worn thin at the soles, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped into the storm after the black shadow rushing ahead of her. The snow rose to her knees. Every step was a struggle. The wind wailed through the pine trunks like someone crying, and Bear kept running a few yards ahead, then stopping and looking back to wait for her to catch up, leading her down a slope she would have been afraid to set foot on even in daylight. She didn't know how long she'd been pushing through the snow. She only knew her calves had gone numb and her lungs burned from the cold air, until the beam of her flashlight swept across something that shouldn't have been there, a dark piece of metal jutting out of the snow, and then she realized it was the wheel of a wheelchair, overturned, almost completely buried. Her heart slammed upward when the light reached a man's face, his eyes closed, his lips bluish-purple, ice already crusted like a shell over his eyebrows and black hair. and in one terrible instant she thought she'd come too late. Bear pressed his muzzle into the man's neck and whimpered, and Mara dropped to her knees in the snow, pulled off her glove, pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw, and waited in breathless fear until she felt a pulse, weak and slow, but still there. He was alive. She had no time to ask who he was, why a strange man in an expensive coat was lying helpless in a wheelchair deep in the woods, or why the lower half of his body felt so strangely heavy and motionless when she tried to pull him. She slid both hands beneath his arms, braced her back, and strained, but he was as heavy as a wet stone, and on the first attempt she managed to drag him only a few inches, before slipping and falling backward into the snow. Mara clenched her teeth, got up, unwound the scarf from her own neck and wrapped it around his chest to give herself something to grip, then tightened every exhausted muscle in her body, and dragged him forward in short stretches, 1.5 feet at a time, stopping to breathe, then dragging again, while snow packed into her sleeves and slipped down her collar with a cold that cut all the way to the bone. Bear didn't leave. He stayed close against the man's side, as if trying to shield him from the wind, now and then taking the edge of his coat in his teeth to help pull, and it was the dog's stubborn presence that kept Mara from collapsing and giving up halfway through. She thought of Caleb, of the night someone had knocked on her door to tell her that her husband wasn't coming home, and something obstinate inside her refused to let one more person die in the cold while she could still do something. The slope seemed endless, but foot by foot, through the storm, through the darkness, through the trembling of her own body, the poorest woman in the valley dragged the most ruthless man in the state toward the dim yellow light, spilling from the window of her crooked wooden house, though she didn't yet know what she had just pulled into her life. The first sensation that returned to Roman Falcone wasn't pain, but warmth, a warmth so unfamiliar that his body reacted to it as if it were a threat, and he snapped awake with the reflex of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for the knife in his back. His eyes flew open, his pupils tightening in the dim yellow light of an oil lamp, and before reason could shape the place around him into anything he understood, his hand had shot out and clamped around the wrist of the person bending over him, squeezing hard enough that he saw the woman shrink slightly from the pain. His mind raced through the worst possibilities. This was someone sent by the man who had betrayed him. He had been taken alive for torture. This was another trap. But then his eyes swept the room, and nothing he saw fit, any script he knew, 4 smoke-stained wooden walls, a wood stove crackling softly, blankets patched over and over again, the scent of pine resin and thin soup, a raw poverty so bare it couldn't have been staged. The woman didn't scream, didn't jerk her hand away, didn't beg. She simply stood still beneath his grip and looked straight into his eyes with brown eyes so calm they unsettled him, then said in a voice hoarse from exhaustion that he was lying in her house, that she had pulled him out of the snow, and that if he wanted to break the wrist of the person who had just saved his life, he could go ahead, but it wouldn't help his legs move again. The final sentence struck him like a blow, because only then did Roman become aware that he couldn't feel anything from the waist down, that he had tried to push himself up by instinct, while the lower half of his body still lay dead and numb on the mattress like something that didn't belong to him, and a terror colder than the snow flooded through him as the truth crashed into his awareness. He released her wrist, not out of kindness, but because his body had suddenly betrayed him in a way worse than any enemy ever had, and for the first time in many years, Roman Falcone felt something whose name he had almost forgotten: helplessness. The woman stepped back, rubbing her reddened wrist, but she didn't speak a word of blame. She only poured a cup of warm water and set it beside him within reach, an ordinary act so simple that it made him more suspicious than if she had raised a knife. In his world, no one gave anything without calculating the price. Kindness was always a sugar coating wrapped around a hook, and he lay there watching her move through the cramped room, trying to read the true scheme behind that tired face. When she asked his name, Roman answered after a pause just long enough to build a mask. He said his name was John, a name so plain it was almost faceless, and that he didn't remember what had happened, a lie he released as smoothly as breathing. He didn't say that a 4 hours drive from there, an entire empire believed he was dead. He didn't speak of the man who had pushed him into that ravine. He didn't speak the name that made his hands clench into fists beneath the blanket at the mere thought of it. He watched the woman the way he would watch a card not yet turned over, measuring how useful she might be. A woman living alone in the woods, with no proper phone, no visitors, completely isolated, and a cold part of him had already begun calculating how to turn her solitude into his own escape. But even as his mind moved along those familiar, ruthless grooves, One detail kept catching and refusing to be filed away: the fact that she had risked her life by plunging into a snowstorm to pull home a stranger she didn't owe anything to, an act that made no sense according to every logic he had ever lived by. The enormous black dog dropped heavily onto the floor between him and the door, set his great head on his front paws, and stared at him with unblinking amber eyes like a silent guard. And Roman Falcone, a man who had once made grown men tremble with a single glance, realized that tonight his fate rested in the hands of a poor widow and an animal, and neither of them knew who he truly was. By the next morning, the storm had eased, but the sky was still thick and gray, and Mara took the risk of walking 3 miles down the snow-covered road to call the only person in the area she trusted, Dr. Owen Pruitt, a 62-year-old retired physician who still kept the habit of treating both people and animals in places where the nearest hospital was hours away. He arrived with his old, worn leather bag and kind gray eyes behind his glasses, asked very little when he saw the strange man lying on the bed, only glanced once at Mara and then quietly set to work, while Roman let the man examine him with the wariness of a wounded animal, watching every movement of those aged hands, as if waiting for a poisoned needle. Pruitt pressed along his spine, tapped lightly at both knees, dragged a dull pin along the soles of his feet, and watched his reaction, then thoughtfully asked whether he could feel any pressure at all, however faint, and Roman was forced to admit that he could. A distant sensation like an echo rising from the bottom of a well, somewhere around his hips and upper thighs. The old man nodded, removed his glasses and wiped them, then said in the cautious voice of someone who didn't want to plant false hope, but also couldn't bear to hide the truth, that from what he could see, Roman's spinal cord hadn't been severed. What had paralyzed him was most likely compression, a clot of pooled blood or swollen tissue pressing against the nerves after a severe injury, and that meant the damage might not be permanent. Pruitt went on to say that with rest, warmth, and most importantly, the patience to keep doing the right movement exercises for many weeks, there was a chance the signals would return, little by little, though he also warned plainly that nothing was certain, and the process would hurt so badly that many people gave up halfway through. To Mara, the diagnosis was a shaft of light. She breathed out in relief and pressed him with questions about how to care for him. But to Roman, every sentence from the old man opened a maze of cold calculations, because many weeks was time he wasn't sure he had, and lying paralyzed in a wooden house deep in the forest meant he was vanishing from his own world at the exact moment he needed to be present in it most. In his mind, an invisible clock had begun counting backward, because he knew exactly what was happening. A 4-hour drive from there, knew that when a boss disappeared without leaving a body behind, his empire wouldn't mourn. It would be torn apart at once, and the man who had pushed him into this ravine was surely settling comfortably into the seat of power he had coveted for years, offering false words of grief for a man who wasn't truly dead. Each day that passed was another day for the traitor to tighten his hold, buy loyalty, rewrite the story in his own favor, and every ounce of power Roman Falcone had spent his life building was quietly changing hands while he lay here helpless, unable to move his legs, without even a telephone, unable to call anyone without risking the revelation that he was still alive. That was the trap, more intricate than any bullet, because if he rushed to contact the wrong person, the news would reach his enemies before he could get back on his feet, and this time they wouldn't make the mistake of letting him survive again. Pruitt packed up his tools, gave Mara a few instructions, and left, leaving behind a man lying motionless beneath a smoke-darkened wooden ceiling, his mind spinning between two cruel truths: that his body might recover but needed time he didn't have, and that in order to survive now, the most ruthless man in the state had to stay still, keep his mouth shut, and depend entirely on the kindness of a poor woman he still couldn't understand. In the days that followed, Roman was forced to lie still in one place, and because he could do nothing but observe, he slowly pieced together the life of the woman who had saved him, a picture so harsh that even he, a man who thought he had seen every form of human desperation, was left silent. Mara Whitlock left the house before dawn and came home after full dark, working the morning shift as a kitchen helper at Mrs. Hattie Boone's diner in the town of Hollow Creek, then spending the afternoon cleaning rooms at a motel across the road. 2 hard labor jobs stitched together, and still not enough to cover the red numbers he had seen her counting over and over on that first night. He noticed the stack of papers tucked beneath a tin box on the windowsill, the letters with the bank notices printed in bold, the hospital bills from 2 years earlier as thick as a slim book, and he understood that this crooked wooden house, The last thing she still owned was counting down week by week toward foreclosure. Roman had once controlled streams of money larger than an entire town's budget, had ruined men with a single phone call, so he understood all too well the noose of debt tightening around her throat, and what unsettled him in a strangely sharp way wasn't her poverty, but the fact that she carried it without once complaining in front of him. Once, she came home with her face drawn tight after a long day, and through the crack of the door he accidentally heard her murmuring calculations to herself, wondering whether, if she skipped her own meal, she would have enough money to buy pain medicine for her worn-out back. And yet when she stepped into his room, she still asked whether he had eaten and gave him the larger share from the pot of thin soup. He also gradually understood why, that night, she had said kindness was a luxury, because through broken fragments of conversation, he realized that the entire town of Hollow Creek looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. People whispered behind her back about the poor widow living alone in the woods, and some even believed she had brought ruin on herself because she was too stubborn to sell the land, as if poverty were a sin worthy of punishment. One morning, Mrs. Hattie stopped by with some old bread, a 55-year-old woman with a grumbling mouth but warm eyes, and Roman lay still, pretending to sleep while listening to the two women talk. He heard the diner owner scold Mara with rough affection, saying the girl worked like an ox and yet never agreed to accept even a single dollar of help, then heard Mara answer softly that she didn't want to owe anyone else anything, that the only thing she had left was her dignity, and she wouldn't trade it for food. That sentence kept echoing in Roman's mind, because in all his life, dignity had always been something people easily sold when the price was high enough, and he had never met anyone so poor they had nothing left, yet still valued it more than a meal. The only thing that made her truly smile was the enormous black dog. Bear followed her everywhere through the little house, resting his head on her lap every evening as she sat quietly beside the fire, and Roman saw that the animal was the only support keeping this woman from collapsing beneath the weight of it all, a wordless bond between two living beings who had both grown used to being left behind by the world. Roman watched all of it through the eyes of a man who had only ever believed in power and fear, and for the first time, he felt himself shaken by a kind of strength he couldn't name, the quiet strength of a woman who had nothing in her hands except exhausted shoulders and a dignity that neither hardship nor the contempt of an entire town had been able to break. One evening, when the wind was beating against the window panes and the fire in the stove had burned down to glowing embers, Roman broke the familiar silence with a question that surprised even him by rising from his own mouth. He wanted to know where the dog had come from, because by then he was clear-headed enough to understand that Bear wasn't the kind of dog people kept merely for pleasure. That body of nearly 150 pounds, the old scars crisscrossing his shoulders and muzzle, the way he always lay between the door and his owner, all of it said that this animal had once been trained to do something very different. Mara looked up from where she sat beside the coals, placed her hand on the great head of the dog resting in her lap, and began to tell the story in a low, slow voice. Bear, she said, had once been an abandoned guard dog. People had found him chained in a deserted lot after his former owner got into trouble with the law and disappeared, all skin and bones, covered in wounds, so vicious that everyone said he should be put down because he couldn't be tamed anymore. She said her husband, Caleb, had been the only one who refused to believe that. He was a firefighter, the kind of man who didn't leave anyone or anything behind in a fire, and he had patiently gone back to that dog for weeks, sitting quietly outside the reach of the chain, only so the animal could slowly get used to the presence of a human being who wasn't carrying a whip or a stick. Until one day Bear finally ate from his hand. Caleb brought him home, gave him that name, and the dog, once considered by the whole world to be something worthless, became the loyal shadow that followed him everywhere, until the night Caleb never came home from the fire, and from then on, Bear had only Mara left, two abandoned creatures clinging to each other in order to survive. Roman lay still and listened to the entire story, and a strange feeling rose in his chest, because in every detail about that animal, he saw the faint outline of himself, a man trained to create fear, covered in scars from battles no one remembered, pushed to the edge and left to die by the very people who should have stood on his side. He looked toward the amber eyes of the dog, half asleep beside the embers, and for the first time, he understood why the animal had unsettled him from the beginning. It wasn't because Bear threatened him, but because Bear resembled him so closely that it was almost like looking into a mirror. The same guarded instinct, the same fierce exterior hiding something too deeply wounded to trust again. Mara went on, almost as if speaking to herself, saying that people kept thinking animals like Bear were born cruel, but she believed no animal was born evil, that they only became that way because of what the world had done to them. And the miracle was that beneath all those scars, loyalty was still intact, only waiting for someone patient enough to awaken it. She didn't look at him when she said it. She was talking about the dog, but every word fell into the small room and settled over the motionless man in the darkness, as though it had been spoken directly to him. And Roman Falcone, the man who had ordered countless lives, ended without so much as blinking, lay there listening to his own heart beat strangely before a simple truth no one in his life had ever taught him, that perhaps what made a living being was not the wounds it carried, but what it might still become if someone were willing to look at it through different eyes. Bear opened his eyes slightly, looked at him for a moment through the red glow of the dying coals, then closed them again. And in that brief glance, Roman had the peculiar feeling that the animal had recognized him long ago, had known he was one of his own kind, another survivor just pulled out of the snow. Following Dr. Pruitt's instructions, Mara began helping Roman with movement exercises, and that was when the man's true nature showed itself in its barest form, because nothing strips a person down faster than pain and helplessness combined. Every morning before she went to work, and every evening when she came home, she bent and straightened his lifeless legs, massaged the muscles that were slowly wasting away, placed his hands on the wooden bar she had temporarily nailed to the wall so he could pull himself up, and each time, Roman answered with the only weapon he still had left in his hands, a tongue as sharp as a razor. He sneered that she was wasting her time, that she thought she was a doctor now, that the little rubbing tricks of a maid who cleaned rooms couldn't possibly heal anything. He said cruel things calculated to wound her, to push her away, because in his world, driving people away had always been safer than letting them come close. But Mara didn't take the bait. She didn't cry, didn't shout back, didn't leave the way he secretly expected her to. She only kept doing what needed to be done with a calmness that drove him nearly mad. And when he let loose his most poisonous words, saying that she had saved him only because she wanted to feel noble in the middle of a town that looked down on her, she paused for a single beat, looked straight at him, and answered shortly that she had saved him because he was dying. Simple as that. And if he wanted to turn that into something ugly, that was his problem, not hers. That answer silenced him, because he was so used to every action hiding some scheme beneath it that he didn't know what to do with a person who did something good without asking for anything back. And that confusion was even more uncomfortable than the pain gnawing at him. The exercises were exactly as Pruitt had warned, painful enough that there were times Roman clenched his teeth until blood broke through, sweat pouring from him even in the freezing room, and there was one session when he slapped her hand away, roaring at her to leave him alone, telling her he would rather lie paralyzed than let her see him weak like this. Mara quietly drew her hand back, but instead of leaving, she sat down on the little stool a few steps away, folded her arms, and waited. And when his anger had settled, she only said softly that she wasn't going anywhere, that he could curse at her as much as he wanted, but tomorrow morning they would keep going, because his legs didn't care about his pride. There was a hardness in her that he gradually understood wasn't meek endurance, but a kind of steadiness, forged through loss, because a woman who had buried her husband and carried a mountain of debt had nothing left to fear from the insults of a strange man lying helpless in bed. On the first night after the hardest session, Roman couldn't sleep, not because of the pain, but because for the first time in many years, he was lying in a space with no guards outside the door, no weapon beneath the pillow, no shell of power wrapped around him, only himself, laid bare beside all the things he had always been running from. In the darkness, he heard Mara's steady breathing from the corner of the room, and the dog turning over beside the stove, and the images he had forced down for so many years began to rise, the face of someone he didn't allow himself to remember, a name he had buried along with the last human part of himself. He turned his face toward the wall, clenched his jaw, and tried to shove them back down the way he always had. But tonight the wall of ice he had built around himself had developed a hairline crack, and through that crack slipped a faint light he was both afraid of and unwilling to block out. The image of the woman sitting patiently on the little stool, not leaving, not demanding, only staying. Roman Falcone lay awake until dawn began to pale the sky, and for the first time, with a deep unease, he wondered whether the thing slowly melting inside him might be far more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. That crack widened a little more with each passing day, and one night, when sleeplessness once again kept both of them awake beside the fire. Mara was the first to speak. She talked about Caleb, not in a mournful voice, but with the tenderness of a wound that had already become a scar. She told Roman about the man who always ran toward the place everyone else was running away from, about the night there was a fire at the old warehouse district on the edge of town, about how Caleb had gone back inside a second time to search for someone who was said to still be trapped within, information that later turned out to be wrong. She said the ceiling had collapsed before he could get out, and what had tormented her for 2 years wasn't only losing him, but the fact that he had died because of a mistake, because of a mistaken order, because he had trusted information that never should have been trusted, and that it had taken her a very long time to learn how not to let her anger at that senselessness eat her alive from the inside. Roman listened in silence, and something in her story touched the deepest wound he had buried, so deeply that before he could stop himself, he heard his own voice say into the darkness that he too had once lost someone because of a lie. He hadn't meant to speak. In his entire life, he had never told this to anyone, but that night, inside the wooden house cut off from the rest of the world, beside a woman who had just laid her own wound bare, his defenses opened for the first time. He told her, little by little, that he had once had a younger brother named Luca, much younger than he was, the only person in the world he had truly wanted to protect, and that Luca had died, not because of an accident, but because of him, because he had believed a poisonous whisper poured into his ear, because he had acted from anger and suspicion before he could stop and ask whether it was true. He didn't explain who the whisper had come from, didn't speak the name that even now made his chest tighten when he thought of it. He only said that by the time he realized he had been deceived, it was too late. His brother was gone, and from that day on he had locked himself inside a coldness of his own making, punishing himself by refusing to let himself love or trust anyone again. Mara didn't offer any hollow comfort. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, because she knew words like that carried no weight for someone who had carried guilt for too long. She only sat there quietly, then said softly that she understood the feeling of living through the same moment again and again, imagining thousands of ways she might have done something differently. In the red glow of the embers, two people from worlds that couldn't have been farther apart realized they carried the same wound, the same survivor's guilt, the same haunting memory of an order or a false belief that had taken the person they loved most, and that silent understanding bound them together with a thread no words could have created. Roman looked toward the woman sitting by the stove with her arms wrapped around her knees, her brown hair falling across one side of her face, and he realized she didn't pity him. She wasn't afraid of him, even after hearing him confess that he had caused someone's death. She only looked at him as if he were a human being, someone broken in the same way she was, and that was something no one had ever done for him in a life built out of fear. Bear lifted his head between them and rested his chin on Roman's knee, in a gesture so natural that both Roman and Mara went still. And in that moment, beneath the wooden roof in the snowy woods, 3 abandoned creatures sat beside one another in the first warm silence. Roman Falcone had known since the day he lost his younger brother. The understanding of that night didn't make Roman soften his voice or say thank you, because that wasn't his way, but it quietly drove him to do one thing, and when he had recovered enough strength to sit up in the wheelchair Mara had managed to repair, he began calculating how to reach the outside world without revealing that he was still alive. There was only one person he could trust: Vito Marchand, the 33-year-old bodyguard who had followed him for nearly 10 years, the only man in the entire empire who had been given chance after chance to betray him in exchange for profit, and had never once done it. A man of few words, loyal to the point of rigidity, and most important of all, not among those who had been present the night Roman was pushed down into the ravine. One afternoon while Mara was at work, Roman rolled his chair to the only old landline telephone in the house, the one she still kept for emergencies, and after weighing every risk, he called a secret number known only to Vito, speaking in the private code the two of them shared, brief enough to confirm that he was alive and in hiding, warning the man not to breathe a word to anyone, not to try to bring him back too soon, because right now one wrong move could get him killed. But the first thing Roman asked Vito to do wasn't to investigate the traitor, wasn't to gather what loyal forces remained, but something that made even the bodyguard on the other end of the line fall silent for a moment. He gave Vito the name of the bank and the numbers he had quietly memorized from the papers on the windowsill, ordered him to use a sum of clean money that couldn't be traced back, pay off every debt strangling Mara Whitlock's house, erase the hospital bills from 2 years earlier as well, and do all of it through layer after layer of intermediaries, so that no one, not even she, could ever trace where the money had come from. He repeated again and again that this had to stay absolutely secret, that she must never know, and when Vito cautiously asked why his boss was doing this for a stranger, Roman was silent for a beat, then answered shortly that he owed her a life, an answer that was true but not complete, because even to himself, he wasn't ready to admit the rest. He hung up, erased every trace of the call, then rolled his chair back to its usual place by the window. And that was when he realized Bear was lying right below the wheels of his chair. The enormous black dog, the one who in the first days had always positioned himself between Roman and the door like a wary guard, had now chosen on his own to lie close beside him, resting his great head on Roman's lifeless foot, the warmth from his body seeping through the thin fabric. And in that simple gesture, there was an acceptance that made Roman's throat tighten in a strange way. He reached down, hesitated, then placed his hand on the dog's head, and Bear didn't pull away, didn't tense with suspicion. He only let out one long, satisfied breath and closed his eyes, trusting Roman in the way animals recognize something inside a human being before that person can recognize it in himself. Roman sat there for a very long time, his hand resting on the head of the animal the whole world had once cast aside just as it had cast him aside, and he understood that he had just done the first decent thing in his life without expecting anything in return. No power, no gratitude, not even a thank you, because the person he had helped would never know. And the strange thing was that this very anonymity made him feel lighter in a way he had never felt after any deal or any victory. The days that followed carried a new rhythm, softer, yet also more dangerous, because once the hostility between them had melted away, what came to take its place was something neither Roman nor Mara knew how to name or how to handle. The physical therapy sessions were no longer a battlefield. Her hands on his legs had become familiar, and sometimes, while she was bending and stretching his muscles, they would both look up at the same time and their eyes would meet for longer than necessary, a moment stretching until the air felt tight before one of them hurriedly looked away. Roman hated himself for it, because each time she bent close, he found himself noticing things he knew he shouldn't notice. The way a brown lock of hair slipped down against her cheek, the calluses on her hard-working hands, the faint scent of stove smoke and snow clinging to her coat. And he warned himself that this was exactly the kind of weakness that could get a man like him killed. In the world he had once lived in, affection was an opening for enemies to crawl through, a lever people used for threats, and he had watched too many powerful men fall simply because they let their hearts command their minds. So a part of him screamed that he had to rebuild the wall, had to push her away before it was too late. But Mara was no less torn. She still carried Caleb's image in her heart, still felt as if she were doing something wrong each time she caught her own heartbeat quickening in the presence of this strange man. A man she knew was hiding something enormous about who he truly was. A man she shouldn't trust, and even more shouldn't allow herself to care for. She told herself this feeling was only the result of two lonely people trapped beneath the same roof in the middle of winter, that it would fade once he grew stronger and left, and she clung to that reassurance as if it were a lifeline. One evening, when she knelt to bandage a scrape on his arm, the room held nothing but the glow of the stove fire. Bear slept in the corner, and in that stillness her hand accidentally paused on his wrist, right where he had hurt her with his grip in those first days. They both realized it at the same time, and instead of pulling away at once, she lifted her eyes to him, her face only a hand's breadth from his, and Roman felt his breath stop. In those brown eyes, he saw the same uncertainty tearing through him, the same fear and the same longing held tightly back. For one moment that seemed to last forever, the distance between them shrank until it was almost gone. He could feel the warmth of her skin, and both of them hung suspended on the edge of something that, once crossed, could never be undone. Then Roman was the one who quietly turned his face away first, not because he didn't want it, but because he wanted it too much, and the truth that he was lying to her about who he really was suddenly pressed down on his chest like a stone. He knew exactly what he truly was, knew how much blood had stained this hand, and he had no right to pull a decent woman into the darkness where he belonged. Mara drew back too, her cheeks flushed, murmuring that it was late before turning away to lower the fire, but her hand trembled slightly as she did it, and the small room still rang with the sweet and aching tension of something that had nearly happened, something both of them knew wouldn't be easy to forget. That night, lying in the darkness only a few steps apart, both of them stayed awake, both staring up at the wooden ceiling and wondering what they were rushing toward. one afraid that affection would expose every lie he was hiding, the other afraid that her heart was betraying the man she had lost. And between them, the black dog shifted in his sleep, the only living creature in that house who slept peacefully that night. 4 hours away by car, in the dark wood-paneled office that had once belonged to Roman, Silas Crane sat behind a desk that wasn't his, with the calm composure of a man who believed he had won, until one of his men stepped in with news that made the fingers he had been tapping in rhythm freeze in midair. They had gone back to the ravine to finish disposing of the body as planned, but beneath the melting snow, there was only the overturned wheelchair and faint drag marks leading back up the slope. No corpse, no blood trail sufficient to confirm a death. Silas rose, walked to the window overlooking the city strung with lights, and for the first time since the night he had shoved the man he once called his boss into the abyss, a cold unease slipped down his spine and into his perfect calculations, because he understood better than anyone that a living Roman Falcone, even barely breathing, was still more dangerous than an army. He couldn't raise a public alarm, because doing so would expose the story of the boss's death that he had worked so hard to build as a lie, so he chose the quiet way, calling Frankie Doyle, a cold-blooded 44-year-old man who specialized in doing dirty work without leaving a trace, and ordered him to quietly search every town, every clinic, every motel within hours of the woods where Roman had been left, looking for any sign of a strange wounded man, paralyzed in both legs, appearing out of nowhere. Frankie accepted the order without asking a single question, spread out a map of the mountain region, and began circling sparsely populated places where a man could disappear, and his invisible search net began tightening toward the small towns along the forest, including one name hidden beyond the pine ridges, Hollow Creek. Meanwhile, back at the wooden house, Roman knew nothing about the storm moving toward him, but the survival instinct forged over a lifetime made him begin to wrestle with another question, one that had been gnawing at him since the call to Vito. He was far too used to suspecting everyone to be at peace. And now, as he lay there replaying every detail, a poisonous thought kept rising without end, that Vito Marchand was the only person in the world who knew he was still alive, the only man to whom he had given information that could get him killed. And if the traitor in the past could have been the person he trusted most, then what guarantee was there that history wouldn't repeat itself? He remembered the brief hesitation from Vito when he heard the order to pay Mara's debts, remembered the strange silence on the other end of the line, and his suspicious mind began weaving an entire web of doubt, turning harmless things into proof of a plot, exactly the way years ago he had let one poisonous whisper turn his younger brother into a traitor in his eyes. Roman didn't realize that he was walking back into the same old track, that fear was once again steering him toward the deadliest mistake of his life. He saw only the threat, and reacted with the old familiar instinct, coldly weighing whether he should cut himself off completely from the only bodyguard who might still be loyal. That night, he sat for a long time by the dark window, one hand unconsciously resting on Bear's head, torn between the instinct of suspicion that had shaped his entire life and a new, fragile voice that had begun to kindle inside him during these past days, a voice reminding him of the terrible price he had paid the last time he trusted doubt instead of trusting a person. And he had no idea that while he sat there torturing himself with doubts aimed at the wrong place, the real danger was quietly drawing closer to Hollow Creek with every passing hour. Frankie's net tightened around Hollow Creek on a cold gray afternoon, when the stranger in the expensive coat stepped into Mrs. Hattie's diner, sat down at the counter, and ordered a cup of coffee he didn't even bother to drink, his cold eyes sweeping the room as if he were measuring every person inside it. Mara was wiping a table in the corner when he spoke, his voice falsely gentle, asking in an offhand way whether any stranger had shown up in town lately, whether anyone had been hurt, whether any family had suddenly taken in a sick person, and although he asked the whole diner, his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have. Mara's heart slammed upward, but she kept her hands from trembling, kept wiping the table with an indifferent air, and answered that a small town like this never had strangers passing through, while her mind spun wildly, fitting the pieces together. The man she was hiding in her house, the identity he was deliberately concealing, his unusually paralyzed legs, and now this stranger carrying the scent of danger, searching for exactly those things. Frankie didn't believe her. He stood and moved closer, lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear, saying he was looking for an old friend who'd had an accident, that if someone was sheltering this man without knowing who he really was, they could find themselves in very serious trouble. that people tended to disappear in little towns like this, and every word he spoke was a velvet-wrapped knife pointed straight at her. Just as the air in the diner thickened with fear, the door swung open, and Jonah Mercer, the town's 30-year-old sheriff, stepped in with a calm manner but sharp eyes. He had noticed the unfamiliar car parked outside for some time, and the instinct of a man who guarded the gate of a small town told him something wasn't right. Jonah approached the counter, polite but not soft, asking what the visitor from out of town needed in Hollow Creek, asking to see his papers, and the presence of the uniform, along with the sheriff's unyielding gaze, forced Frankie to back down, because a man who specialized in working in the dark couldn't allow himself to be officially recorded. He gave a faint smile, said he had only stopped by to ask for directions, then left a bill on the counter and walked out. But before he reached the door, he looked back at Mara one last time, a look meant to be burned into memory, and she understood that he would come back. Once the car had disappeared, Mrs. Hattie let out a breath and cursed city men under her breath, while Jonah lingered beside Mara, quietly asking whether there was anything she needed help with, whether she was in some kind of trouble, and for one brief moment, she almost told him everything, but fear for the life of the man in her house, and the instinct that this matter was larger than anything a small-town sheriff could carry, made her only shake her head, thank him, and hurry home. She almost ran the entire way back, her heart tangled between two fears, fear of the stranger and fear of the truth about the man she was hiding. And when she pushed the door open and stepped inside, she froze before a sight that turned every thought in her head to ice. Roman was standing, both hands gripping the wooden bar on the wall, his whole body shaking from the effort, sweat pouring down his face, his legs supporting part of his weight for the first time since that night in the snow, the legs she had thought were dead now, answering his will with the faintest response after so many weeks of pain. He lifted his head and looked at her, and in that meeting of their eyes there was both the fragile joy of a body coming back to life and the heaviness of the news she had just brought home, because she had to tell him that someone was hunting for him, that the small, safe place they had built had begun to crack, and that the time for him to stand steadily on his own legs again was perhaps no longer as long as they had believed. That night Roman called Vito one more time, this time not to give an order but to interrogate him, his voice cold and sharp as steel as he pressed the man, asking whether he had told anyone where Roman was hiding, whether he had let even a single detail slip, because someone had traced him to this exact town. The other end of the line went silent for a moment. Then Vito answered in the calm but wounded voice of a loyal man being doubted, saying he would rather put a bullet in his own head than sell out his boss, that for the past 10 years he had proven that with his own life, and if Roman still didn't believe him, then he could cut him off, but the truth wouldn't change because of it. It was that bluntness, that refusal to beg, that made Roman go still. And then Vito added something important, explaining that even though the untraceable funds were routed perfectly, the manager of the local bank branch had been meticulously monitoring Mara's accounts, and the name he mentioned made Mara, who was standing nearby listening, turn pale. It was Dale Hutchins, the manager of the local bank branch, the man who for the past 2 years had always worn a mask of false kindness whenever Mara came in to ask for more time on her debt, the man she had once naively believed might still have some goodwill toward her situation. When the enormous debt of a poor widow was suddenly paid off in silence through murky layers of intermediaries, Dale was the first person to notice that something was wrong, and when the stranger named Frankie began drifting around town, handing out money and asking about unusual things, Dale connected the two events and sold that information for a handsome price, telling Frankie that the only person in the area who had just experienced a strange financial change was Mara Whitlock. The truth left Mara stunned with bitterness, because the person who had betrayed her wasn't some unfamiliar killer, but a familiar face in whom she had once placed a small measure of trust, exactly as she had once said, that kindness was a luxury, and now she understood why. But for Roman, that moment carried an even more terrible weight, because he realized he had nearly repeated the very sin that had destroyed his life. He had suspected Vito, the only man who was absolutely loyal, had been ready to cut him off, and perhaps even have him eliminated because of a web of suspicion woven by his own fear, while the true source of the leak had been a link he had never even looked at. He sank back into the wheelchair, cold sweat breaking across his skin, because Luca's ghost suddenly returned with merciless clarity, the younger brother who had died unjustly because Roman had believed a poisonous whisper instead of trusting his own blood. And now, if Vito's explanation hadn't come in time, he would have repeated that tragedy a second time. For the first time in his life, Roman Falcone admitted to a subordinate that he had been wrong. He said over the phone in a hoarse voice that Vito had been right, and that Roman had accused him unjustly. Words that almost no boss in his world had ever spoken aloud. And on the other end of the line, Vito stayed silent for a long while before answering softly that he understood, that fear distorts all of us, and that he was still here, still as loyal as he had been for the past 10 years. Mara looked at the man sitting bowed in the oil lamp's glow, and she understood that what had just happened wasn't only the exposure of a traitor, but the moment Roman faced the very mechanism that had turned him into such a ruthless man for so long, the habit of choosing suspicion instead of trust. And this time, because of one pause taken at the right moment, he hadn't allowed it to steal another life. Bear quietly came over and rested his head on Roman's lap, and inside the little house in the woods, while danger was closing its circle outside, something within that man finally began to heal. Knowing that the net was tightening, and that time was no longer on his side, Roman decided he couldn't keep lying still and waiting anymore. He had to strike first, but this time not with bullets, not with bloodshed, but with the weapon a lifetime as a boss had taught him was more dangerous than death itself: recorded truth. He instructed Vito to quietly approach those who had once belonged to the organization, but had been pushed to the margins by Silas after the purge. The dissatisfied capos, the old loyalists now treated with suspicion by the usurper, and from those scattered fragments of information, a horrifying picture slowly came into focus, clearer than anything Roman had ever suspected. Vito tracked down an old contact, an aging accountant who had once kept the organization's hidden books, a man who, fearing Silas would silence him, had secretly held on to certain recordings and documents as protection for himself, and when Vito placed them in Roman's hands through a carefully arranged meeting, the man who had thought he had already reached the bottom of betrayal finally understood that he had never known the whole truth. In those old recordings, Silas Crane's familiar voice rang out clearly, and word by word it exposed a conspiracy that had been nurtured for many years, because it turned out that the poisonous whisper long ago, the one that had made Roman suspect Luca and give the order that led to his death, had been created by Silas himself. The consigliere Roman had trusted as his right hand since the very beginning of his rise had deliberately fabricated false evidence to accuse Luca of betrayal, pushing Roman into blind rage, because young Luca was beloved, naturally seen as the heir, and stood between Silas and the power he had coveted for so long. That truth struck Roman like a blade driven through old layers of wounds, because for all those years he had devoured himself with the guilt of killing his brother, had believed that his own haste and suspicion were the only culprits, never knowing that he had merely been the knife in the hand of a man who had calculated everything coldly from the beginning, a man who had stood beside Luca's coffin with a false face of grief, and then kept smiling at Roman throughout all the years that followed. Rage surged through Roman so violently that his hands began to tremble, and his old instinct screamed for him to tear the traitor apart with his own hands, to make him die as slowly and painfully as possible. That was the man Roman had always been, the one who settled everything with blood. But in the middle of that fury, the image of Mara sitting patiently beside the fire and Bear's trusting eyes suddenly rose before him and held him back, reminding him that if he killed Silas in the dark, the way Silas had once tried to kill him, then he would forever remain the monster Silas had shaped him into, and Luca's death would never receive true justice. Only another corpse and another endless spiral of blood. Roman sat for a long time that night, torn between the man he had been and the man he was struggling to become, and in the end he chose a path far harder than pulling a trigger. He wouldn't eliminate Silas in silence just to satisfy his hatred. He would expose the entire truth, use these very pieces of evidence to strip off Silas's mask in front of everyone he had deceived, so that Luca's death would finally be called by its rightful name, and so that Silas would lose the one thing he truly valued, the power and fear he had murdered to steal. He ordered Vito to back up every piece of evidence in multiple copies, hide them in safe places, and quietly send word to the dissatisfied capos that the boss they thought was dead was still alive and held in his hands the very thing that could bury the usurper, laying a trap Silas knew nothing about. But even as every piece was being set in place, Roman understood that Silas wouldn't sit still and wait to be unmasked, that once he scented danger he would strike first, and a cold instinct warned Roman that the blow wouldn't be aimed at him, but at the new weakness he had just revealed, the small wooden house in the woods and the woman inside it. Roman's instinct proved true on the very next stormy night, when the wind howled loudly enough to swallow every sound and the snow lashed against the windows as if trying to tear the house apart. Bear suddenly sprang up from where he had been lying, the fur along his spine bristling, a deep, guttural growl rising from somewhere low in his chest and aimed straight at the door. Mara had only just realized something was wrong when the door was kicked open, and Frankie Doyle stepped inside with another man, carrying guns and a deadly cold even sharper than the wind outside. He had found this place, and this time, he hadn't come to ask questions, but to erase every trace, both the man he had been ordered to eliminate and the woman who had dared to hide him. Everything happened in a blink. Frankie swung his gun toward Roman, who was sitting in the wheelchair in the corner. But Mara, driven by instinct, threw herself in front of him, and Frankie turned the muzzle toward her instead, growling that she should have minded her own business instead of dragging trouble onto herself. At the very moment he aimed the gun at Mara, Bear lunged like a massive black shadow, nearly 150 pounds of fur and muscle honed over a lifetime for one single purpose: to protect. The dog sank his teeth deep into Frankie's gun arm and slammed the man's whole body to the floor, the gunshot going wild into the ceiling amid the growling and the panicked shouting. The other man swung the butt of his gun down onto the dog to save his partner, but Bear wouldn't let go. He held fast to the danger threatening his owner with every bit of loyalty Caleb had once awakened, in an animal the whole world had cast aside, and in that chaos a second gunshot rang out, this time not missing, and Bear gave a soft, pained cry, but still refused to release him. In the middle of that horrifying scene, something impossible happened. Roman Falcone braced both hands on the arms of the wheelchair and stood. The legs that had once lain dead beneath the snow now trembled as they bore the weight of his body through the strength carved out of weeks of painful training, and he took his first limping steps in desperation and fury, one step at a time, as if tearing through the limits of his own body. He staggered forward, seized the gun that had skidded across the floor, and with the cold precision of a man who had once been the terror of an entire state, he fired and fatally brought down the man beating Bear, then aimed straight at Frankie. The man who had only just stumbled into his first steps now stood there like a wall between the killers and the living beings he loved. Frankie, his arms slick with blood from Bear's bite, looked into the gray eyes of the boss he had believed was dead, and understood that the whole situation had turned against him. He dropped his gun and surrendered when Roman ground out each word, telling him that he wouldn't give him the easy death he deserved, that he would live long enough to confess everything. But Roman had no time to feel triumph, because the moment the danger was under control, he turned back, and his heart seemed to stop at the sight of Mara kneeling on the floor, both hands pressed hard against the wound, pouring blood from Bear's side, calling the dog's name through choked sobs. The giant animal lay there, breathing hard, his amber eyes already dimming, yet still trying to look up at his owner, his tail striking the floor weakly as if to reassure her that he had done his duty, that he had protected the one he loved. Roman dropped the gun, dragged himself forward on legs that were not yet steady, and fell to his knees beside them. For the first time in his life, he saw his own hands that had only ever known how to bring death, trembling as they pressed against a wound and tried to hold life inside a fading creature. He shouted for Mara to call Dr. Pruitt at once, his voice breaking in a way no one had ever heard before. And inside, the wooden house filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood, while the storm still raged outside. 3 abandoned beings clung to one another once more. The dog who had risked his life to shield them both, the woman fighting to keep him in this world, and the man who had just found his legs again, only in time to face the fear of losing something he had never dared admit he treasured so deeply. Frankie Doyle's testimony, recorded by Jonah Mercer that very night when the sheriff arrived after Mara's emergency call, became the final piece that closed the trap Roman had laid, because now, besides the old recordings exposing the conspiracy against Luca, he also had a living witness admitting that Silas Crane himself had ordered the elimination of both Roman and the innocent woman. Roman didn't choose to rush back to the city and personally end the traitor, the way the old version of him certainly would have done. Instead, he arranged a meeting with the key capos in the organization, men Silas still believed he had firmly in his grasp, and Roman appeared there in flesh and blood, standing upright on legs that had only just recovered, alive before the very faces that thought they had attended his funeral. The return of a dead man was enough to silence the entire room. But what truly destroyed Silas was when Roman played the recordings, letting the consigliere's own voice echo between the 4 walls, word by word exposing how he had fabricated false evidence to accuse Luca of betrayal, how he had manipulated Roman's anger like a man pulling strings on a puppet, how he had killed that innocent younger brother simply to clear the path for his own ambition. Silas's face, always calm and trustworthy for 20 years, cracked for the first time when he looked around and saw the fear in the capo's eyes turn into disgust. Because even in this ruthless underworld, there was still a line, and inventing lies to murder the boss's own younger brother in order to steal the throne was a betrayal that even the coldest men despised. Silas struggled, turning toward his men and giving orders, reaching for the threats and promises that had once helped him seize power. But not one of them moved, because the power he had built on lies had collapsed the moment the truth was spoken, and now he was nothing but a solitary man stripped bare in front of the very people he had once manipulated. Roman stepped closer, and in his hand was the gun. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the shot everyone believed was inevitable. Silas himself closed his eyes and waited for the bullet, and there was one moment when Roman's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. One moment when all the years of hatred and guilt screamed inside him, demanding to be released through blood. But then he thought of Luca, of how, if he pulled the trigger, his younger brother would forever remain only a name erased in the dark instead of a victim cleared in broad daylight. He thought of Mara sitting beside the fading dog in the wooden house, of the way her eyes would look at him if he returned with more blood on his hands. And he understood that killing Silas now wouldn't be justice, but only Silas's final way of dragging him down to his level. Roman lowered the gun, and in a voice colder than the bullet, he said that death was too gentle for a man like Silas, that he would have to live to watch everything he had stolen turn to ash, to face the law and the eternal contempt of the very world he had once ruled. He handed Silas and all the evidence over to Jonah Mercer and the authorities, a choice no boss before him had ever made, and when the cuffs tightened around the wrists of the man who had destroyed his life, Roman didn't feel the thrill of victory, only a quiet emptiness, the stillness of a man who had finally set down the burden he had carried for so many years. Armed with the same bulletproof evidence trail, Jonah Mercer wasted no time arresting Dale Hutchins at the local branch, ensuring the corrupt manager would face severe federal charges for conspiracy and banking fraud. Silas was led away, his mouth still hissing poisonous words, but Roman no longer bothered to listen. He had already turned his back on that entire underworld, with only one thing still urging him forward: the need to return as quickly as possible to that wooden house, where a dog was fighting for his life, and a woman was waiting for him. When Roman returned to the wooden house after a road that had felt endless, he stepped inside, carrying a fear that a lifetime as a boss had never taught him how to face, the fear of losing a living being he loved. And the first sight that struck his eyes was Dr. Pruitt bent over bare, after many long hours, his aged hands stained with blood, his face marked by the exhaustion of a merciless struggle against death. The old man had done everything he could with the few tools he had brought, removing the bullet, stopping the bleeding, stitching the wound beneath the flickering oil lamp, and when Roman came closer, Pruitt lifted his head, took off his glasses, and wiped away the sweat, then said in a hoarse voice, though his eyes had softened, that the dog had passed through the worst of it, that the bullet hadn't hit anything vital, and that if he was cared for carefully, Bear would live. Those few words seemed to drain every last bit of strength Roman had left. He collapsed beside the dog, his newly recovered legs no longer able to bear the weight of everything he had just endured, and he placed his hand on the familiar black fur now rising and falling with each weak but steady breath of life. Bear slowly opened his eyes and looked at him, those amber eyes still bright with recognition, his tail tapping once lightly against the floor, and that tiny gesture from the animal who had risked himself for him, the animal once cast aside by the whole world just as Roman had been, brought down the last wall of ice Roman had built around his heart for so many years. Something broke open inside his chest, not violently, but quietly, like ice melting beneath the first sunlight of spring, and for the first time since the day he had stood beside Luca's coffin, with a face gone hard because he wouldn't allow himself to collapse, Roman Falcone began to cry. At first he cried without sound, only his broad shoulders shaking and tears sliding down the hardened cheeks of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to weep. And then the sobs broke free, impossible to hold back. He cried for Luca, for the years he had imprisoned himself in guilt and hatred, for the innocent younger brother he had failed to protect, and for the self he had lost long before the night he was left behind in the snow. Mara knelt beside him without saying a word. She only placed her hand on his shoulder, and that quiet presence said more than any comfort ever could. because she understood better than anyone what it meant to cry for someone she loved and had lost, and for the part of her own life that had been lost with him. In the small wooden house deep in the woods, beneath the dim yellow oil lamp and beside the familiar bed of coals, the man who had once terrified an entire state sat there crying like a child between a poor woman and a wounded dog. And there was nothing weak in that moment, because a person had to be terribly strong to lay down every weapon he had and finally let his pain flow into tears. When the emotion slowly settled, Roman lifted his eyes to Mara, and in his gaze there was no longer the cold, frozen mask of the boss he had once been, only a bare human being who had finally set down the burden he had carried for so long, and he quietly said he was sorry. Sorry for lying to her about who he really was. Sorry for bringing danger to her home, and that he didn't know whether a man like him still deserved forgiveness. Mara looked at him for a long time, then answered in a gentle but steady voice that she had known for a long while he wasn't John, that she didn't need to know who he had been in the past. She only needed to know the man sitting in front of her now, the man who had chosen to put the gun down, the man crying for a younger brother and a dog, and that maybe forgiveness wasn't something people deserved to receive, but something they learned to give themselves. Outside, the storm had finally passed, and for the first time after many winters, the fragile light of a coming dawn began to slip through the cracks of the wooden house. Winter passed, and with it passed the old Roman Falcone, because the man who remained in Hollow Creek when the snow melted was no longer the boss who had once made an entire state tremble. He had done what no boss before him had ever dared to do, quietly dismantling the underground empire he had once built, handing over what needed to be handed over, turning what remained onto a lawful path, and withdrawing from the world of shadows not in defeat, but as a man who had finally chosen the person he wanted to become. He used the fortune once stained with blood to do something that carried the meaning of atonement, creating a foundation named Caleb Whitlock, dedicated to supporting the families of firefighters who had fallen while rushing into flames to save others, so that the name of the man Mara had loved wouldn't be forgotten, but would become a flame that warmed many other families. Mara now knew the whole truth about the debt and the house he had once secretly saved, and instead of being angry because her pride had been wounded, she understood that it was the way a man, unaccustomed to speaking of love, had learned to give something good without needing to be acknowledged. There had been a moment when Roman meant to leave quietly. He told her that a man with a past like his could only bring danger into her peaceful life, that she deserved a man who didn't have darkness clinging to him, and he had packed his things, ready to disappear from her life forever, because he believed that was the best way to protect her. But when he reached the doorway, Bear was the one who stopped him. The dog, now healed from his wound, stood between Roman and the way out, looking at him with amber eyes, as if reproaching him. And then Mara stepped forward and said she had already buried one man she loved because of things beyond her control, and she wouldn't lose another one because of misplaced nobility, that if he truly wanted to protect her, then he should stay instead of leaving. And Roman stayed. The man who had once believed he belonged only to darkness chose the light of a small wooden house in the woods, chose mornings waking beside the woman who had taught him that dignity wasn't found in power or money, but in the way we treat one another, and chose a simple life in which, for the first time, he felt he was truly living and not merely existing. In the peaceful afternoons that followed, people often saw two souls life had once left behind, sitting together on the porch, and between them lay the enormous black dog, who had risked his life to stitch broken hearts back together. Three beings once cast aside who had now found in one another a home, a family, and a reason to believe that no one is beyond saving. The story of Roman, Mara, and Bear reminds us of one simple yet profound truth, that a person's kindness, no matter how small or poor it may seem, still has the power to soften even hearts that seem to have turned to stone, that every person, no matter how many mistakes they've made, still deserves to be seen with respect and given the chance to begin again, and that sometimes what saves us isn't power or wealth, but a hand reaching out at the right moment and a heart willing to stay. If this story has touched your heart, please hit like, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more meaningful and moving stories every day. How do you feel about Roman and Mara's journey? And in your own life, has a small act of kindness ever changed an entire person? Please leave a comment and share the deepest feelings in your heart, because we're always hoping to hear your story. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment, and may everyone watching this video always have abundant health, a joyful life, serenity, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next stories.